And you hear the left talk. Getting rid of FEMA would be an abdication of responsibility. It'd be, the end of the United States as we know it. Of course, I say that about just about every single government agency. Joining now to decide whether that's true is Mark Meckler, co-founder and president of Convention of States Action. Mark, nice to have you back.
Always good to be with you, Steve.
So as the Trump administration pares back on these different agencies and in departments and so forth, to me, it looks like it's responsible to trim back the spending. We've got redundancy and overspending and bloat and all of this. And we've seen, obviously, DOJ found billions of dollars in wasteful spending and fraud and abuse. What about FEMA? Somehow we survived the earthquake of 1906 and other great cataclysmic events in American history without FEMA. How did we do it?
Yeah, we did it because the states did what they're supposed to do, which is they are sovereign entities and they're supposed to take care of their own people. And actually, responding in an emergency is one of the fundamental things that government is supposed to do. And the more local, the better. If you have an emergency in your town should respond. If your town can't handle it, maybe your county, and then maybe your state. But the federal government should not be responding to localized emergencies.
And what is I'll use that earthquake in San Francisco, 1906. Pretty good example. Most people have at least heard of it. Giant, devastating earthquake, but it pretty much was limited to California. Should federal government respond to such a thing? Is there a role for federal government and state government to play on the same field?
No, I don't think so. And by the way, the framers of the Constitution didn't believe so. We know of the famous debate between Hamilton and Jefferson about big government versus small government, but a place where they both agreed, which was that if a state can do it, then the federal government can't, and vice versa. This is strictly the province of the states. And if states want to enter into mutual support agreements, which they do all the time, if they want to say, hey, we'll help you in an emergency if you help us in an emergency, that's the way that you get broader assistance if it's needed. We see this, for example, in California all the time. They have these huge wildfires, and firefighters from the surrounding states will come in through state agreements between the states. We don't need the federal government to intervene in that.
Plus, you get helps from the native tribes of America and Canada. You get Canadians that come in, smoke jumpers from Canada that come in. Good example from the forest fires. When did this all start to happen then? You look at FEMA. I know the EPA came in by executive order by the administration of Richard Nixon back in the early 70s. But where did FEMA come from and when and under whose directive and under whose constitutional authority? I'll ask you that, Mark.
Yeah, I think you're hitting the key issue is under whose constitutional or what constitutional authority. And the answer is it's authority that was created out of thin air by the Supreme Court under what we call the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause was supposed to give the federal government the power to regulate interstate commerce. Back then, what they meant was to smooth out the shipment of goods between states. That's been expanded radically since the 1930s to give the federal government the power to regulate or be involved in almost anything they want. Examples include, as you said, FEMA, but it's also the EPA, energy, education. These are things for which the federal government has no constitutional authority other than that invented out of thin air by the Supreme Court.
So one of those things, I believe, is the Chevron doctrine that you're referring to. And the Chevron doctrine got its wings clipped pretty good here last year in June when the Supreme Court was handing out decisions, right? It pared back a lot of that power. The Supreme Court today is on the right path to clean this mess up, but will they get there?
Yeah, I think the answer is clearly they won't get there. And here's why I say that. The Chevron doctrine was a doctrine that just said that if an agency promulgates a regulation, it's up to the agency to interpret that regulation. The courts don't really have much of a role. It was called Chevron deference. In other words, they would defer to the interpretations of the agency no matter how ridiculous. So they got rid of that doctrine. What they didn't do is get rid of the agencies themselves. There's no authority for these agencies. And even among the most strident conservatives on the Supreme Court, I don't think there is an appetite to really limit the Commerce Clause doctrine. So I just don't think we're going to see the courts do that for us.
So that leaves us with these agencies that were also created. Look, the EPA, created by executive order, is maybe one of the most egregious examples of creating an agency that is now funded to the tens of billions of dollars. The bill handed the American taxpayers, and to what end? So they can attack my water supply, tell me they can regulate the mud puddle in the driveway of my farm. I mean, honestly, this is what these regulatory agencies would do because they've never seen a rule, a regulation, a bit of power that they turned their back on, have they?
They haven't. And I think one of the things that's so outrageous about this, Steve, is that your state, wherever you live, wherever I live here in Texas, we all have our own version of the EPA. Every state protects its own environment. And frankly, I think they do a much better job than the EPA because they're local folks who understand the environment. In some cases, for example, in California, the California Environmental Quality Agency is much more strict than the EPA. So I think it should be up to the states on a state-by-state basis. We certainly don't need the EPA, folks thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., lording over us, telling us how we can or can't use our land. And then fundamentally and importantly, I believe that's still completely unconstitutional.
Yeah, let me ask you how this plays in something Donald Trump did here this past week, knocking down the California EV rules that would have mandated that California only be allowed to sell electric vehicles in 2035, 10 years, less than 10 years now. And 80% of the cars on the road had to be EVs as well. Well, that got knocked down because that was going to be extended to all the states. Again, that's a complete disruption of the constitutional order, is it not?
It is. We all know the doctrine of federalism, the idea that the states have individual power vis-a-vis the federal government, and that was supposed to be a balance. What most people aren't familiar with is something that California was practicing there, which we call cartelized federalism. In other words, what they do is they want stricter environmental laws, stricter regulations of all kinds. They get together with other blue states and they lobby the federal government to go along. And they also force these car companies or other big industrial concerns to manufacture according to California standards. The way they do that is California is the biggest market in the nation. It's very difficult to make cars for every individual market. So they make cars according to the toughest standards. Those are California standards. That allows California to impose their standards nationwide. And it's really good what Trump did, which is slap that down.
And that's just the latest example of trying to realign. But look, a lot of this stuff's been afoot for not just a couple of years or a couple of decades, but many decades. Yeah, you look at the Chevron doctrine and those sorts of things. These go back decades, as you say, to the 1930s. We can do some repair work in 3 or 4 years, but we can't get it all fixed, can we, Mark?
Okay, I mean, there is no silver bullet. I think this is important. It goes back really about 115 years. The Supreme Court, about 115 years ago, really quits looking to the framers of the Constitution, original intent, and they start just giving us the interpretation of 9 people in black robes about what the Constitution means. This is a very difficult problem. The framers didn't anticipate this problem. In fact, what they thought was that the courts would be the weakest of the 3 branches of government. They had neither the sword nor the purse to enforce their rulings. They had no idea that eventually people would just take a knee before the Supreme Court and allow it to do whatever it wanted. So This is a problem that requires a fundamental structural fix. And I don't believe Washington, D.C. is going to do this by itself.
I don't believe so either. Mark Meckler, co-founder and president, Convention of States Action, DIY Nation, and so much more. Mark, thank you for being here. We have to leave it there for today, but it's a good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.